So please say your name whenever.
So Yaron, we didn't decide who was going to do the screen, the chair stick. Should I do that?
Yeah, you're cutting off, please.
Am I cutting up?
Yep.
Oh, all right. Guess I might have to move that or stop video. Is that better?
It is better.
Yeah. All right. So Yaron, are you going to throw up the chair deck?
Yeah. Let me put it on full screen and share again. Let's see if that works.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the slides.
You should now. No?
No. Is it just me?
So I just want to say, I can see your slides.
All right. I got to rejoin, obviously. All right.
Hello again. Can I see the slide?
Yeah, that fixed it for me.
Good.
All right.
Okay.
Maybe we should get started.
Let's do that.
All right. Let's start by getting volunteers for note taking here. We need somebody to help us take notes. There's a note taking tool built into the Meet Echo thingy. It's sort of up. Says note taking tool is sort of the third icon from the left in your icon bar. So it should be pretty easy. Just have to activate it. But we do need somebody to actually fiddle with it.
Just to be clear, we can't move forward if we don't have a minute taker.
But I don't know
well, we can
about what's going on, so it may be very useless, but I will try.
Thank you.
And who was that? I heard somebody offer, but who offered?
Volunteering.
Oh, Michael Richardson. Thank you very much, Michael. All right then.
Thank you, Michael. And can we have a Jabber scribe? Basically, your job as a Jabber scribe is to alert the chairs if there's something interesting going on in Jabber that requires to share with the group. There usually is a lot of discussion on Jabber. Not everything needs to go on the mic, but if people ask for it to be on the mic, please channel it into Meetecho. So do we have a Jabber scribe?
Stefan, can I volunteer you? Jabber is actually mirrored into the chat room here in Meetecho. So all you need to do is to keep track of the Meetecho chat.
Yes.
Stefan, do you think you could do that? Maybe not. Anyone? Anyone else? Someone?
After the Jabber session, what do you want me to do if I need to bring something to the chair's attention?
Just request. Just do request audio or just speak.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you, Mike. And that was Mike
you,
Jones,
Mike.
right?
Yes.
All right then.
All right. So the note well applies to this virtual meeting, just as it applies to in-person meetings. Please take a look. If you're new, please find the note well on the IETF website and get yourself acquainted with it. No blue sheets this time, and otherwise we're good.
That's right.
So,
go ahead.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're a bit, no, we're still on time. So right after Leif and I finish, it's on to Dick talking about the latest progress with his proposed XAuth protocol, and then Justin with XYZ. Kathleen will be comparing the two protocols. This is the central session for this meeting, and it will be followed by discussion, which we expect to be, again, around the comparison of the two protocols and bringing us towards consensus on what will be the basis of the NAP protocol. So a few words of status, especially to those who are new here. This is the first meeting of the NAP working group. After 2 meetings as above, we have a new chair, Leif. We still don't have any working group documents, and we, as I said, our main goal for this meeting is to move towards a document that we can adopt as a basis for the NAP protocol. Anything else, Leif or Roman?
I think Roman wants to say something.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to reiterate what you just said, Yoran. So first off, you'll notice that the chairs in the virtual front of the room are different. First off, I'd like to thank Dick Hart, who co-chaired kind of two BOFs that got this work kind of kicked off. So Dick, thank you so much for helping shepherd the work to this point, to the point where we have this new working group. And I'd also like to thank Leif, who's now stepping in as the new chair to now that we have the working group and getting started. And Joran, thank you for continuing with us from the BOF now into working group chair. So all very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roman. And with that,
I think it's time to get the first presentation going.
yes.
Brian, so I keep seeing some people asking to share screen, and I think that's people just sort of misclicking on an icon. But you know, suffice it to say, if you actually do want to talk or you know, present that we're not expecting you to do, please get in the queue so we can actually schedule you properly. Yes, and I think with that we're on to the first presentation, right?
Yes.
And that is Dick, who is actually going to share his screen. So I think you have to drop sharing, and
I guess I have to drop. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, there we go. All right, we can't hear you, Dick, if you're trying to speak. So you
audio is actually separate from video. It's funny, so you need to enable audio for yourself. You should be on now.
Can you hear me now? There we are.
Yes.
Okay. Seems like every meeting we get to learn a brand new tool again. Okay, I'm Dick Hart. I'm going to talk about XAuth, and hopefully I can figure out how to get my buttons to go in slot, advance. There we go. So a quick intro, go over the goals, go over the key features. I did an implementation, going to share some of the learnings, share some of the changes I made since the last meeting we had, and then talk about some open items. So XAuth, similar to XYZ, here's the parties, the user, the resource owner, the grant server, the client, the resource server. Often the resource owner is the user. Key terms, claims, statements about the user, authorizations. These are things that enable the client to access a resource server. A grant, I define a grant as being the combination of claims and or authorizations that the client is requesting from the grant server. The grant server is effectively a combination of an authorization server from OAuth and an OP from OpenID Connect plus other stuff. And the interaction is how the client and the GS negotiate how the user is going to move over to the GS to provide authorization. The general sequence, the client first makes a call to the GS to say what it would like to do. The GS often says, well, here's how you can interact. The client would say, redirect the user over to the GS. The user authenticates and then authorizes at the GS. The user gets sent back to the client, and the client can then get the grant from the GS. So in XAuth, some example URIs, the main endpoint is a GS URI. And then when a grant is made, it's represented by a unique URI. And any authorization itself also has a unique URI. So the goals, same ones that I had in the last meeting: extensible, easy to migrate, easy to reuse stuff before. Let's not reinvent things we don't need to invent. We want it to be scalable. I'll go into some more details what I mean by that. And of course, your sort of simple and flexible things, which are a little more vague. So extensible, the top level claims, or sorry, top level properties in both the request and the response. There's the user, the client, the interaction, authorizations, and claims. So extensible, and the new properties could be added to any of these things, as well as new top level objects. Migration, reusing the client ID. So for sites that already have a pre-registered client, they can reuse that ID, reuse the scopes, reuse OpenID Connect claims, both in what they get back direct from the AS as well as ID token. I'll talk a little bit more about how to use the user info endpoint later. Reuse, we're reusing a bunch of things now. I've also moved to using RAR right away. RAR as a top level thing is what is in an authorization, our RAR requests. Now that Justin's made the suggestion that the type in a RAR is just something defined by the authorization server. So a decomposed grant server. So this is one of the goals, is how do we can decompose something so we can have a separation of concerns. And so in XAuth, right, there's an options call that goes to get the options right off the GS endpoint. A post on the GS endpoint creates a grant, which itself might create an authorization. A get off of the GS grant, that particular URL will go and get routed to a read grant, and a get on the authorization will go and do a read OSI. And in typical deployments, that read OSI, which is your refresh of your authorization, is the highest volume call. And so the decomposition allows you to also do things like shuffle sharding, where say in that identifier, say part of that identifier is which client it is, enables you to shuffle shard across different servers. So we have here 8 different clients that are spread across 6 different servers. And so if you're not familiar with shuffle sharding, say client D has some error and it's just hammering the servers, and it takes down all the servers it can reach. All the red things are what gets hammered down, but all the other clients are able to still hit a server that works.
Dick,
yep.
Sorry to interrupt, but if it's really, really easy for you, I would like to ask you and the other presenters to share video. I think it'll be easier on the participants. If it's not easy, forget about it.
I think I just clicked the video link somehow.
Yes, you did.
Oh. And how do I select camera?
Yeah, so this doesn't look like you.
It's a piece of beta software I have that's a virtual camera. And now I'm just looking to figure out
so if that's a problem, we can skip it.
Huh.
Yep, let's keep going.
Okay. So key features, it's a RESTful API, separation between the client ID and a client handle, the interaction modes, claims, from the grant server and Jose client authentication. So the RESTful API, here's sort of the core API endpoints. And so this enables you to sort of just using other verbs, be able to go and have some more advanced API endpoints. So being able to update and delete a grant, update and delete an authorization, get options on both a grant and an authorization. Makes it easy to sort of decompose the whole grant server, having this RESTful API and do the shuffle sharding. So we have both the client ID and the client handle. So the client ID being this, what it typically was used in OAuth and OpenID Connect, not including the dynamic client registration where someone's pre-registered their client. It's an identifier for any instance of the client. It's not any specific instance. In an implementation, the GS really only needs read-only access to information about a client ID. And typically, maybe there's, say, thousands of these IDs. Where a client handle, it's for a dynamic client that maybe in some point has shared a fair amount of information about itself, but it's an identifier for a single instance of the client. The grant server has read-write access, since of course a client is dynamically coming in and an identifier being created for it. So the grant server needs to be able to have write and of course read. And because there's an identifier for each instance, and so say there's a popular mobile app that's being used, there can easily be billions and billions of handles. And so that has different requirements on your storage. Just because we've made them separate here doesn't mean that an implementation couldn't fold them all and store them all in the same place if they wanted to. But I felt it's important for us to have a clear way for a GS to be able to differentiate between these two types of clients. Interaction modes. So in XAuth currently, there's the redirect mode, which is your typical back and forth between the user sends user from the client over the GS and back, or it could be through the browser or through a mobile app. And then I like the term sort of decoupled modes, which is the interactions are separate between where the user is interacting with the client and the user is interacting with the GS. One of those is a user code where the user is shown a code and they go to a separate device and authenticate and enter the code. Another one's an indirect one, like a QR scan, which, anything that's indirect like that, susceptible to cessation fixation. So the redirect mode, here's a graphic of showing how that works. And an indirect mode where the user's scanning the code and then interacting at the GS. And of course, the challenge here is that the user could have just been clicking on a link that came from some attacker, and there's no way for the client and the GS to know that they're really interacting with the same user. Some URI examples of the interaction. So in redirect, the client sends over a completion URI where it wants to go when it's done, and the GS sends back the redirect URI. And the decoupled modes, the client sends over, here's where I'd like you to send the user for information about stuff, as sort of what's the next step after it's done. And then the GS sends an indirect URI if it's enabling an indirect, or a display URI for where the user would enter the code. Claims from the grant server. So, I think we want to reuse the OpenID Connect claims and ID tokens, W3C's verified credentials, and we want to enable any other kind of schemas that are out there to represent claims. And also, I'd like to get the claims directly from the grant server so there's no access token required. So just to clarify that, we have our flow of request and interaction between the client and the AS. User authorizes that, and then the client can just make that call back and he gets back the claims from the AS. And so there's no requirement for a separate access token or a separate RS endpoint. The AS doesn't need to manage access tokens and the client doesn't need to manage access tokens. The Jose client authentication. So we put that in the authorization header for get options and delete, and then that's the body of the post in a post, put, and patch. and we include the URI and the HTTP method in the payload so that then they're independent of how they got moved around. So then they could be moving to different components within the GS in a decomposed GS. That signed request enables you to have non-repudiation of the client request. You know, this client actually made this request at this time with all the context. Jose, you know, it's just using existing crypto libraries. I'll show a bit of code that shows how straightforward it was. And each of the components, as I mentioned, can verify essentially that client request independently of each other without having to trust some upstream component. A bunch of implementation confirmations that I had. You know, it was a lot of things sort of worked as expected. A number of things worked nicely of sort of having, you know, a schema in the claims and doing it, being able to work with the code. Some learnings, you know, when I had the space separated scopes, it's like, oh, it's not just an array. I have to go and do a split on it to use it. What wasn't a huge issue, but sort of changed the coding a bit. The OIDC claims have a null value at times. And so, you know, often in my coding anyway, I'll go to check to see if a value exists by just checking it there. But of course, if it has a null value, then that returns back false. And so you had to use has own property. But once again, I'm using how these things have already been used in OAuth and OIDC. The claims.oidc.userinfo.mail is a long path. I've got a suggestion on how I might change that at the end. Separate top-level objects for authorizations was clumsy. In my latest draft, I've collapsed those, so there's just authorizations. There was some property that had a dash in the name. Of course, that's messy in JS because you have to put quotes around it. So I changed that. When you get that first request, in order for you to know who the client is, you got to actually peek inside of the JSON, you know, the Jose object to figure out who the client is, to then decide and grab out the information so you know how to authenticate that first call. I had to rethink how my routing worked to fix that. The JSON validation is brittle. It's all hand-coded. A JSON schema might be a better way to implement some of those things. And of course, I still suck at HTML, and you know, lots of new things had happened in ES6 since I'd last worked with JavaScript, and so probably half of my time was spent fiddling with things at the end. Here's some code that I had. This is a command line dynamic client making a client request with Jose. This is all the code to sign the message, just using an existing library. It was pretty straightforward to go and do this. Here's the routing code I have in the grant server. You know, so you can easily see all the different routes and the different methods that all then go to a separate component. Made it easy to sort of really break out into different pieces of code, each type of functionality. I had different modules for how to validate each part of the request. So that worked really well. And I also was checking the interaction policy. You know, I'd made up a policy saying that if the client wanted write access to something, it couldn't have an interaction, and that the GS says, I want to have confirmation that you're working with the same user that I'm interacting with if write was being asked for. So that worked well. And then here's the QR code that my client would spit out, and I would just scan that on my phone and then access it. So I thought it was pretty interesting that I could just go and have the CLI client that would be able to go and mint its own key pair and make the call, and I could go and authorize it, and then that CLI client now had, you know, an access token to be able to make calls without me having to, you know, paste an access token into my source code. And then, you know, in that client at the other end to go and read that grant, you know, here's the code for that. It once again was pretty straightforward. And in that other first call, I'm generating a key and putting that into the header as a JWK, you know, which was really straightforward to do. So differences in the protocol, big thing I did was, I got some feedback that it was a big document, and so I split it into 3. There's sort of the core document, which is primarily everything we've covered. I pulled a whole bunch of the more advanced features into a separate document, and then I factored all the Jose stuff into a separate document. I collapsed, authorization and authorization into one thing. I didn't have the whole interaction mode negotiation in 06 that I had in the implementation and in 13, which enables the client to say, here's the different ways I can interact with the user, and then the AS can say, well, here's the interaction modes that I allow. In contrast to XYZ, I think it's important that the server knows, how is the user going to come over and how is the user going to go back, if they're going to go back at all. One of the main reasons for that is to be able to know whether it's susceptible to a fixation attack. I've had types at the top level of authorizations, and with RAR going to types being defined by the AS, it's like, well, let's just roll that all the way up to the top instead of RARs being a type of authorizations. Definitely simplifies that. And then had added the client handle for a dynamic client, where before the client just identified itself by signing with the same key. Having a handle enables the GS to have a persistent identifier, something that was in XYZ, and then a bunch of editorial changes. These are a bunch of advanced features that are in there. You can look at them in the feature piece. Yep.
We are at time, so.
Okay, this is my last slide. And then here's some sort of open-eyed items. I think since secevent subject identifiers is coming up, we could use that in the user object, add a Siebel-like flow. We have an array of RAR objects. And then for accessing a user info endpoint, you could have an authorizations type that's defined, and then the claims versus just getting the claims direct from the GS. That's it.
All right. Thanks, Dick. I think what we'll do here is, unless somebody has some very specific clarification questions for you, we're going to hold general discussion and questions to our discussion time slot and let Justin continue. All right. I think we'll proceed with Justin very quickly. You're up.
Okay. Yes, and the infinite thing. All right. All right. Can you guys hear me? Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Hi, everybody. First off, I want to say, everybody, congratulations and welcome to GNAP. I was happy to see already a lot of Smurf comments in the chat this morning, and congrats. We've got a new working group, and this is fantastic. I'm talking today about some updates that I've done to the XYZ project since we last met. You can find details of all of this at OAuth.xyz, including downloading our implementations. The Java implementation has been updated to the latest draft, which is -9. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. Also, apologies to the working group for missing the publication deadline by a day or so for draft 9. Without travel driving my schedule, I have no idea what day or time it is anymore. It's crazy. But anyway, the biggest change in draft 9 is actually not a technological change. It's an information organizational change. I refactored the whole document based on the request and response parts instead of trying to, I now see, kind of unsuccessfully lead people through how the bits and pieces might potentially fit together. So now it's more of, catalogs of the different pieces and then discussion about how they go together. There's URLs for grants and tokens. I've refocused how subject identifiers and claims and identity stuff works in it. New interaction capabilities and alignment with some external specs, including some changes in RAR that Torsten and I put in actually back towards the start of the year. And I just realized that hadn't made that over into XYZ yet. And I also simplified some of the underlying technologies that we're using for dynamic systems because it looked like we had built in features that nobody was actually using when they're putting this together. So hopefully streamline things. Overall, though, the core protocol is pretty much still the same. It's still based around polymorphic JSON in a lot of places. I still really believe that makes sense, the ability to pass things by reference in addition to by value. Clients are still identified primarily by their keys, but I'll go into how that identifier structure might actually fit in. The interaction method is still the same inline negotiation. It's just we've now got different parts laid out in the protocol, and we still have both single and multiple access tokens using pretty much the same structure as before. So what I wanted to do right now was go through all of the parts of the document. And those of you who've seen me present before, you won't be surprised that I've got 62 slides today, but you will be surprised that I'm not actually planning to go through all of them. I'm going to go through the major parts of the document structure, and if there are sort of key bits of interest, there's a lot of detail and examples in the slides that I'd be more than happy to go into. And those, of course, you can download these slides off the meeting materials as well and dig into that. So first off, section 2 is all about everything that client sends to the AS to start off this process. One of the biggest changes here was that I pulled in stuff that had been previously peppered throughout the document on how interaction works, and pulled all of the request portions into this section instead of having it be kind of spread out, and it turned out confusing to people. Also clarified how the polymorphism works in line with the sections. Previously, we had everything about polymorphism in a different section, and that turned out to just confuse people. The whole section on handles that was in there before has now been sort of sliced up and put into its appropriate places. We also clarified the difference between requesting resources and requesting user information, and aligned both of those with external drafts. So the RAR specification in the OAuth 2 gives us the at least part of the structure for requesting a resource. We can in XYZ use polymorphic JSON to streamline that in cases where you don't necessarily need the large expanded object. And I explicitly aligned with the subject identifiers draft from secevent for sending and returning user information directly from the AS. And that same alignment happened with presentation of user information. Turns out what we had in there before was mixing a few different things, so we kind of spread that out. Now, section 3 talks all about the response that the server gives once the client makes the request. And just like section 2, it's going through all of the different parts. So what does an access token look like? What are the different parts of an access token response? There's a value, there's a presentation method, there's management. We'll get to that in just a little bit. All of the different interaction methods have defined responses that tie to them, that tie to the request. So this is a point Dick brought up in the XAuth presentation. I absolutely agree that the AS needs to know if the user is going to be coming back or not. And the same thing is explicitly designed into XYZ. The difference is that in XYZ, the way that you request sending the user to the AS and the way that you request getting the user back from the AS are separate from each other. And that's an explicit design decision that we made in how the interaction methods work, based on what we were seeing with OAuth 2 based systems, where anytime somebody wanted a slightly different combination of these things, so the device flow and UMA and SIBA and all of this other stuff, you had to come up with a whole new grant type just to mix things together a little bit differently. So we were trying to get away from that and instead have the client declare, these are the interaction capabilities that I have. And if the AS sees that this client doesn't have a callback capability, it can stop the transaction right there. That's the same here. So I just wanted to point that out because Dick had previously said this was in contrast, and I don't believe it is. I think we're doing the same kind of thing, or allowing the same type of policy. Again, responding with user information. In the draft, I'm much more explicit about saying that the things that come back are subject identifiers and assertions. Those were the two sort of key elements that we had discussed on the list, and that's where I think that we can probably get a lot of agreement on, especially because there are existing schemas out there for them that we can reuse without having to specifically align with any one particular identity protocol. This is something that would let GNAP be used across a wide variety of identity systems. One of the biggest changes is that where previously we had something called a transaction handle and a wait response and a few different sort of more separate things, we've now collapsed all of that into something called a continuation response. And we have management URIs for access tokens, as well as continuing the continuing the request. Section 4 basically says how you deal with all of the interactions that can happen from Section 2 and Section 3. All of these are requirements for how you get the user to the AS and get them back, keeping in mind that GNAP is being built into a world where not everything is going to be over the web. A lot of user interaction with the AS is not necessarily going to be through a web browser, and we need to have that idea really from the beginning, that interacting with the AS might be through an app, might be through sending back-channel messages. But I do think that common flows will mix together sort of common recipes, if you will. So redirect to a URI and callback in a front channel URI, we're probably going to see a lot of those together because we know that that works. Section 5 is how you deal with the continuation response. This is really similar to what you can send is really similar to this to the initial request. It can have most of the same inputs and most of the same outputs. This can be on a different URL though than what the client started out with. And what's important here though is that since the AS is sending back the URL for the client to use, XYZ does not restrict the nature of that URL. It could be the same as the initial request. It could be something that is the same for every single continuation, or it could be like Dick showed in his shuffle sharding example, something that's different per client or per individual request. It's up to the AS to decide how they do that. And I think that that's a really, really important thing, because we've seen with OAuth 2 a lot of restrictions that ASs have within their environments. For example, I do a fair amount of work in the financial space where getting a URL opened in a specific URL opened in a firewall is a very heavy process. And so wildcarding something doesn't work for a lot of people. So I really believe we need to have flexibility here. Now, managing tokens is a new feature here, and this is something that we thought about for a while. Finally got it written down into the spec. The idea is that if you get a management URL back with the token, then you can use that token as the client to call its own management URL to rotate it or revoke it. And an important thing here is that this call is always, pardon me, always bound to some set of keys. If the token is a sender constrained token, you use the token's keys. And if the token is a bearer token, you use the client's keys. Now, I'm not totally sold on that. I don't particularly like that split, but I think that if we have something that is going to allow for bearer tokens, and I have seen no indication that we need to get away from that, then we should have a way to protect calls with bearer tokens as well. Section 7 basically just says how to use tokens. This might be its own document, but ultimately this ends up being really short because all of the information about how you bind a key to a request is in Section 8. These are general purpose methods that the client can use when talking to the AS, the client can use when talking to resource servers, and potentially the resource server could also use to talk to the AS. There's probably too many here for a core protocol, but everything that's in there has been implemented on both client and server side. Several of them in multiple languages here. So I think we as the working group need to decide what mix we want to have in there. The one I'm particularly, the pair that I'm personally most excited for are HTTP message signing and mutual TLS, because I think that those two together are going to solve most of our use cases. Section 9 is a really short bit on how you can do discovery, because XYZ was designed to kind of get rid of the need for discovery for almost everything in the protocol. So discovery is really an optimization that you can allow for a particularly smart client to go and look up and process things ahead of time. But the interaction methods and the resources and the user info and all of this stuff gets negotiated in line with the protocol. So it turns out you don't need a lot of discovery. Section 10, I'm just going to mention, this was a set of ideas that we had about how to have the resource server potentially interact with the auth server. It's not very well baked, but and it should probably be in a separate document eventually. But these are things that we see in the wild. So I think that we as the working group do need to have this kind of thing in mind as we build things going forward. Appendix B, I unfortunately didn't get a chance to really flesh this out, is about a common data model and common structures to say what an AS is, what a client is, what the access rights for a token or what a resource is. We need ways to be able to describe all of these things for implementers, because otherwise, if we don't do this, we're going to have future specs like backpatch it in like we ended up doing with JOT and token introspection or dynamic client registration in OAuth 2. So this is something I think we need to define now. And finally, I added a set of end-to-end examples. It's not a complete coverage, but it covers what I think are some of the common use cases. Now, in the last 5 minutes, I'd be happy to go into details on any particular point of sort of what's changed and what's remained the same. I can't see the chat, but can somebody give me an indication of, is there something that people would like me to dive into here?
No one said anything.
Okay.
The chat is empty, and okay. I'm going to do the same call for when you end if there are specific questions.
All right, that's fine. I did want to very quickly talk about the continuation structure because that is new here. And the idea here is that instead of just getting back a handle and that telling you to continue at the same URL, you now get back a handle, a URI to use it at, and potentially an indication of how long you should wait before you use it. And this URL could be a stable URL. This is kind of the financial institution case where the AS wants to have a stable URL and the messages coming in get routed internally past the firewall. It could be something that varies per request. So this would be the sort of the front load balanced router thing that that Dick showed in his presentation. Or it could just, currently, it could just come back to exactly the same URL. The important thing is that the client always just goes to that URL, whatever the server tells it to go to. And I think we need to have formal analysis on these methods so that we know exactly kind of what's going on here. And we need to figure out which of these methods we want to enable and emphasize. But I'm very strongly in the camp of not dictating to the AS what its deployment structure should be. Yeah, so this is just continuing after you do an interaction, a hypothetical challenge response kind of thing. You would want to continue if you've got an agent on the client, things like that. And importantly, that same construct can come back after you do a continue. So if you can keep continuing, the server is going to tell you you can keep continuing. This allows us to rotate that continuation credential on every use. But I kind of noticed as I was building this out that this really feels a lot like an access token and a directed resource server case. So maybe this is just an access token, and maybe managing access tokens with access tokens and grants with access tokens is an abstraction that we can make use of here. I'm not sure yet, but that's one of the open questions I have. I do see it is time, so I am going to jump out here. I've got a lot more details that we can go through as needed. So thank you all.
If there are any specific questions to Justin, otherwise we're going to jump over to Kathleen. Are you ready to? Yes. Oh, so request. Do you want a screen share from your? Yeah, I think you should request audio and screen sharing and. Yeah, we can't hear you because you haven't turned on. So turning on video doesn't automatically turn on audio. Yeah, counterintuitive, I know.
Okay, how's that?
Right, how's that? That's very good. So go ahead, Kathleen.
For sharing screen. Okay, let me just make sure I'm showing the right thing before I share my screen. And I guess I'll put it in slideshow mode. No, that's not going to be pretty. All right, so how do I share? I'm not sure how to share the slides.
There's a screen sharing button.
Is it the show presentation view?
Yes.
Okay. And it's going to share my whole screen or what?
Sorry to jump in. It is not show presentation view. It's called enter screen queue, and it's right next to the enter video queue button.
Enter screen queue. But does it show my whole screen or does it show an app?
It depends on your browser. It can show your whole screen or the app. It should give you a choice. It
I
did
wasn't
for me
ready
in
for
Firefox.
this. Yeah, I'm not ready for this. Can somebody else show the slides instead of me? Or no? I just assumed the chairs were going to run all the slides. I guess a poor assumption on my part. That's how the working groups I'm chairing we were planning to do.
Hi, Justin again. Sorry to jump in, but Kathleen, I can probably show your slides unless the chairs would like to do it themselves.
I will do that.
All right, I just have too much up on my computer.
Do it too.
If it was just showing the app, I'd be fine with that.
You are. Can I see
Thank
it?
you very much. Yes, and sorry about that. It's just what I was prepared to do. All right, well, thank you for the opportunity to come in and help to progress work in this working group. Both proposals, honestly, there's been quite a bit of work put into them, and that's very much appreciated. It's not an apples to oranges comparison, and mainly because of the style. of how each of these protocols were designed. And, you know, I've read, I don't know how many drafts before, right, in my former role. So the style taken on was wildly different. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just a really high level evaluation, and this goes on for, you know, quite a few slides. So for XAuth, we have the scope defined pretty clearly. XYZ does it a bit more concisely, you know, both aiming towards a fuller next-gen OAuth, getting there in slightly different ways. And there's some good parts on both of these, really. XAuth is, let's see, it attempts to make the transition lower impact, but it explicitly says it's not fully backwards compatible. Although, you know, just listening to Dick a few minutes ago, and when you look at the document itself, you see the extensibility, you see the reuse of things like a bearer token, a JOT, and other pieces that are present in OAuth. XYZ kind of takes a next step. It revamps it. It's not backwards protocol. It's a new thing that takes advantage of a clean slate. There are some pieces that are reused, you know, JOTs, for instance, are in the protocol. But in the document, it's more baked in, whereas OAuth 2.0 came prior to the Jose work. So of course it wasn't baked in there, right? And so, you know, that assumption isn't there anymore. And so that was changed for XYZ. It's not its separate own thing. It's part of the mix. Interaction flows with XAuth are really quite clear. You know, so there's a set of sequences established, and there's also what Dick calls APIs. And the interaction flows for XYZ are also clear, but they're done very differently. They're more of interaction flows with the specific functionality as opposed to an object abstracted view. Another thing that's nice in XAuth is the setup for use of registries, right? So whatever we do, and XYZ has some of this, but I think in that regard, it was just a little earlier. So the XYZ has hints that could be done, but it's not yet developed into the draft. They are both designed to be extensible, and that will be key for adoption, right? So we've seen that with lots of other protocols in the past, and anytime there's been evaluations of protocols that get adopted and not get adopted, extensibility always factors in pretty highly in that weighing. But they're both set up nicely for that. In terms of the relationships, you know, even I guess when Dick pulled his up, he did say it looks similar to XYZ. It does. XYZ is abstracted. So terms like user client, registered client, dynamic client, they all bundle into resource client, right? And how the user interacts is similar. It's just worded differently. And for XYZ, it's simplified, which is nice in my opinion. You know, you can get to each of the points from the XAuth with the XYZ relationships established as well. So there's not a huge difference there. I like simplified. So I do like that level of abstraction. Let's see. So XAuth has 4 sequences defined, and I guess the sequences, maybe it's not a newish term for you guys. I hadn't seen it defined in that way. It's, you know, I've seen message flows and, you know, other communication type terms put forward. And so the terms used is where the proposals begin to diverge. So from the sequences, the next part is the APIs that are defined in XAuth. Whereas XYZ, I guess, is more, a little what I'm used to for the IETF. They're both valid approaches, and there's no problem with either. XYZ kind of jumps into a protocol flow. And so those are fine, right? There's no big difference there, except that's where it gets more difficult to do a comparison. So then you have to really boil down into capabilities, requirements, and what needs to happen. And those are some things that the working group would plow through anyway, right? What are the core capabilities? To some of the points even Justin made today, what is in the primary document versus additional documents. And I do think there would need to be some scoping in terms of that with whatever gets moved forward. And the use of registries will be important for extensibility and compatibility with other parts of the protocol. If you could advance slides. So in terms of that, for the API, XAuth dives into things like read, write, and object interactions, whereas XYZ is the protocol interactions in terms of functionality. How do I request access? How do I get a single token versus multiple tokens? How do I identify a client, a user? So they're really just broken down a very different way. Let's see, so XYZ's interactions are further developed because it's taken this other stance. However, in the case of both, there's a lot of room for a working group to dive in and specify further. And I'd say both authors did a nice job of that, of including editor notes of, let's take these other steps. Let's see. Both have thrown a dart to deal with authentication later, and that's good. In the same way OAuth 2.0 does, where you have a registry, I think that's the right approach, right? Because it's authorization, it's not authentication. The authentication protocols available are changing. WebAuthn is more popular now than it was, or I guess it wasn't available a few years ago even. And later we might have to adopt to distributed identities or some other authentication protocol, and being able to point to a registry of what's permitted, how it's used, and a document to supplement that is a good thing. So I think that's kind of equal footing for both where that would happen. Cryptographic functions. One really nice piece to XYZ is that the cryptography is embedded. I think that this is an important distinction, and for a go forward, if we're looking at this as a next generation OAuth, is that we do embed the cryptographic functions. If it's a JOT, that's included, fine, but including it in the core document, we're ready for that. Security in general is being more baked in now, right? And so we don't have to treat it like an afterthought. I personally don't want to see just a bearer token invoked without having some cryptographic properties in it inherently, right? So having that rewritten so that the requirements are different, I think is a very good thing. And allowing extensibility, I think I've already mentioned this, should absolutely be maintained. Use of registries is an easy way to do that. Next slide, please. So here I boil down into recommendations. So the working group name doesn't have to match the protocol name, right? So the working group will go away at some point of time. Whatever you use for the name of this, think about that wisely. Also consider that adding a new protocol name to this mix is confusing for this flooded space. And what I mean by that is picture yourself as a new developer, and you are tasked with setting up authentication, authorization, scoping, and any number of other, federation or any other type of consideration that you have to think about in the identity space. And you're new. And you have to look through the sets of protocols available for each of these things. You're not set up right now to do a good job of that. And if we continue adding things to the mix, it's just going to become worse. You know, there's no single place to go to get a recommendation set to say, you know, what are the best options right now? And how has this evolved? If you look to books, unless they're new, they're outdated. So adding new names is confusing. So I do want the working group to think about that. Let's see, OAuth 2.0, you know, it's, in my opinion, you know, it's time to move on from that because of the security deficiencies. And that's going to take years, right? Any kind of transition takes a really long time. So thinking about that now and thinking about how do we make the jump to a more secure authorization protocol, I think is very important, and having it baked in. Let's see. So with that, involving researchers early on in the process for whatever this turns out to be, I think will be important, right? You don't want the security protocol proofing coming in very late in the game, like the, what was it, 89-page document that came in for OAuth. I might be wrong on the number, but it was an extensive report, right? So let's involve them early. I don't think we should worry about backwards compatibility over security. We're moving towards zero trust models in the industry, right? So things are becoming more granular, more modularized. You're having dynamic authentication between these modules. You're having attestation happen between modules. That's only going to increase. I think we're at the early phases of these changes. So simplifying, making threat modeling easier, being able to understand how industry is evolving and how this fits in is important, because this is not going to get integrated into too many things for several years, right? It'll take a few years before it's published in reality. Compatibility, the use of registries, I think is spot on. Dick called this out very explicitly in terms of having the flexibility for other functions. And that's called out a little bit in XYZ. I think that could be made more clear in XYZ. And then, one thing just from watching the list, whatever we go forward with, once adoption has occurred, sticking to issue tracking has really helped in the past. And I highly recommend that each different issue gets documented and that we have a track record to go back to say, well, this is how we came to resolution. And so if some new thing comes up on, a decision that's been made, you have it clearly documented to either say, no, this is why. You don't have to revisit the same decision, but if new information is presented, you could revisit in light of that, and you have your well-documented track record. Yes, and work is still being done to improve OAuth 2.0, and that will happen, just like TLS 1.2 is still in use, right? And you have, I think there's a revision on RFC 7525 even happening, right? So, you have protocols running in parallel for quite a while, and the transition to something new is going to take a really long time for some. And so maintaining the old while the next leap is being done is quite fine. Yeah, so renaming, I guess that's being discussed in the chat a bit. I think, when this gets to a particular point, making sure that we can transition, it's important, right? So if you look at TLS 1.3, that was a really big jump and should have been TLS 3.0. So let's make sure, if that's what's going to happen in the long term, that you leave the flexibility for that name change. And I think for industry, it would be easier because, they'll see how that it's meant to be, the next generation, if that's what it is, and that it's a major leap, that it's a revision jump. So next slide, please.
I believe this is actually the last slide you wanted.
No, I wanted to
No.
do my actual recommendation live.
Go for it.
Thank you. So my opinion here is that XYZ is further developed as a working group draft and bakes in security. So my opinion is that the working group should look to adopt XYZ as a draft, but take in some of the really good work that's happened in the XAuth document. This would be a baseline, and it's been, nicely delimited just about in every single spot in the document that each part is up for working group discussion and amendment. And so, I think that lends itself nicely towards a working group interaction. It is a well-developed starting point. Some of the things that were lacking in it, diagrams, right, and the sequences. Now, sequences felt like a foreign term in reading the XYZ draft. So is that the right term as it's put into XYZ from, how it's done in XAuth, or protocol flow or something like that? But the diagrams, the basic architecture, and the interactions, that should be added fairly soon, I think. And I think that will help quite a bit. And one of the other nice things in the XAuth document that I'll call out explicitly is, so I know Justin was going for the abstraction of being able to say, this field has these parts, but within those larger interactions, what does that full set of fields look like? What's required, not required within the flows? And so having, as the document progresses, having a tighter definition on that, I think could be helpful. So that's my opinion on a way forward. There's been lots of great work done. I don't think it would be too hard to get this merge to happen and to do that, to progress in that way.
All right. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you.
So this gets us to our open discussion, and we fully anticipate lots of vigorous discussion here. So please use the Q function and let's talk about this. What we would like to come away with, if not now, then certainly in the near future here, is a single set of sort of starting points for the working group's progress. And it can either be XYZ or XAuth, or it could be a third thing. But in any case, we sort of have to get to a point where we know what we're working on, and we don't right now. So that's our immediate task as a working group, and that's the purpose of today's discussion, to get us sort of well on the way towards a well-known starting point for the working group. I was expecting a rush to the mic at this point, I must confess.
Yeah, so maybe to kick off the discussion, let's start with questions or comments to Kathleen. And I expect this to devolve into a general discussion about the NAP solution.
I saw Justin stand at the mic and then retreat. Go ahead, Justin.
Sorry. Yeah, no, Yaron changed what we were getting to the mic for while I was standing up. No, I just wanted to first, thanks to Kathleen for doing the analysis. There's a lot of content in both of these documents, and there's enough similarities and enough differences to really kind of lose the thread. And so I appreciate everything she did there. So thank you very much, and thanks to the chairs for taking this approach. In case you haven't, I just wanted to say to the working group, in case you haven't had a chance to read draft 9, yet because I realized it was posted late. Yeah, there's in no way do I want to try to present XYZ as a complete solution. It's something that, you know, has been worked on for about 1.5 years, and there's a lot more that it could do. And so I tried to be clear about spaces where I saw gaps and where discussions could be needed. I think the document might be about 1/3 editor's notes if you read through it. And so if we do decide to start with the XYZ document, or, you know, extract that structure and start on a new document, or however we want to do that, I'm very much in favor of refining that as we go forward.
Yes, Roman.
Did you want to say something, Roman?
Everyone this morning.
While we wait for Roman to get his microphone working, I think at some point we may want to do a hum, like on the general direction of this. And I saw in an earlier working group this morning that chairs were actually trying test hums just to make sure people understood the mechanics of the new virtual hum tool, and we might want to do that if we have time. And you know, but we're not. Oh, Michael, go ahead.
Kathleen, one of the things you noted was the differences in the use of JWT in the two protocols. And I'm wondering if you had some feeling as to whether it should go strongly JWT exclusively, or if there was still some validity in the differences, or sometimes it's not used in the same way.
My opinion there. So the XYZ document also included hashes. In some places, I actually have some notes to send to the list, but I didn't want to do it prior, you know, to see should it be an HMAC. So I think in some cases, embedding just what's needed is good, right? And we should absolutely embrace that. But also where a JOT is required, I think it's better doing it in the core protocol than adding it into a separate document later. So that's the distinction, right? XYZ explicitly said, use this here, right? So this is required. And that wasn't in the XAuth as much, right? So it said you could use them, but there was no, this is required, right? You can get through the whole message block and not use one. And so yeah, that was, you know, so I'd like to see that go forward where, you know, you could use one of the Jose functions, or, you know, including a JOT, whatever you need, or just include, you know, the hash or the HMAC, or whatever's appropriate.
All right. I'm going to let Roman in the queue, unless you had something to add to that, Michael, or if you wanted to follow up. Otherwise, I'm just going to proceed down the queue. Roman?
Sorry about the mic issue earlier. Right, I see the queue filling up, which is good. Honestly, I just wanted to repeat what the chairs were saying. Kathleen finished with a series of recommendations about how to proceed with the actual work. If someone has another idea, we'd love to hear it. Or if you have an objection to what was recommended there, let's kind of hear that too, because we practically need a kind of a way ahead. We don't need to decide all the technical kind of answers here, but we need a plan to get to the technical plan.
That's right. Ben?
Yeah, I just wanted to do a minor follow-up to.
Oh, sorry, Ben. Hang on for a while. I think we may have double dipped here, and Dick was actually before you in queue. So Dick,
yes, I think that's right.
You're up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I just wanted to respond to Kathleen's calls about crypto being in XYZ versus XAuth. The one place where I see Justin has used, HMAC was in sort of a verification around on a response coming back, and I didn't think that we actually needed that to know that it was the same user of both of them, and so that was sort of the one place where I didn't think that we actually needed anything to verify. I think in both XAuth and XYZ, they're both looking that there are a number of different ways for the client and the client to authenticate to the GS. In XYZ, Justin puts a key right into the message. And I thought that different authentication mechanisms are going to have different ways of exchanging keys, and it may not be a asymmetric key all the time. And so that's why I didn't put that into there, and saw that it was easy to go and put the key into a JWK in the job. But I did have that as a separate layer, and there has been discussion on the list of separating out how the client authenticates the GS from the actual core protocol. Well, I've got the mic. I wanted to respond to just clarify what I meant with a difference between the interaction modes in XAuth and XYZ. In XYZ, there's a way for the client to signal that it can get a callback, but there's not a way for the GS to say, yes, you need to do a callback or not, right? The client says, here's what I can do, and the client says, the server says what it can do, but there's not a clarity of the GS saying, here's the only things that you're allowed to go and do. And the modes drive that by saying, here's the modes we have. And I don't think we have that many different modes. So I think that works fine. Thanks.
Okay, so it's back to me.
Yes, please, Ben.
Okay, I wanted to follow up a little bit on, I guess, maybe a tangent to Michael's point. So Kathleen was remarking that it's good that XYZ has like the one true way to do it with the JWT right there in the spec. But I also recall that we have an ACE working group that is essentially taking OAuth and rewriting it to be more suitable for the constrained environments. And so if we hard code JWT in GNAP, are we going to have like ACE version 2 to do the same sort of rewrite of our output to the constrained environments?
ACE is, and they are doing their rewrite, right? So they are including what they can early. So I think you're just going to see divergence for this anyway, right? So if you're doing it in CBOR and it's specific for IoT, I think you just see some divergence now.
Yeah, it may be unavoidable, but I just wanted to mention that in case it was avoidable.
Yeah, well, then you can also just, follow suit and update, right? So that's normally what happens anyway.
Yeah.
All right. Let's let Justin in. And if you feel that you're finished saying what you needed to say, feel free to turn off media and
then get back in the queue if you discover or think of more stuff to say. Justin.
Yeah, so I don't want to get into debating the technical details of the protocol here, but since Dick said it a couple of times, the AS absolutely can detect when the client is not sending a callback and does not have that capability and is fully allowed to reject that request. But I also wanted to, and I don't think we need to debate that detail here. But I wanted to respond to Ben's point, though, about the IoT stuff. There's a lot of different ways that you can approach the translation of a protocol. My personal and recommended take that I hope that we do with GNAP is that we build strongly on top of JSON and HTTP in such a way that somebody wanting to translate that to CBOR and COAP and COSI and everything else will be able to look at what we did and say, oh, you have an HTTP header value here that is this thing over in COAP instead, or you're using Jose here, then we say you use COSI here, or even have a enough flexibility to have different packaging mechanisms inside of GNAP itself, but without getting it into the world of overly abstracted. So I strongly believe that we should avoid some of the sins of the past of like WS Trust and SOAP and whatnot, where you end up with a deeply abstracted protocol that's abstracted from exactly one concrete implementation. Because what happens then, in my experience, and I think this bears out, is that your abstractions end up kind of missing the mark of what needed to be abstracted in the first place. So I hope this is something that we can coordinate with the ACE working group. Maybe by the time the next IETF rolls around, we can co-present wherever GNAP is at that point into ACE and see what the right work should be for there, like what the right move forward would be.
All right, Karsten, you're up.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar to what Justin just said. By actually looking at the problem before we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, we may be able to get this right. So CWT and COSI and so on are structurally rather similar. There are some bug fixes in COSI that are not in Jose, so things sometimes require a little bit of additional information to choose the right case. But let's start with this now and not wait until we have a protocol that actually cannot be simplified for use in the IoT space.
All right. So there's been some discussion in the chat about crypto methods, but none of that has made it into the queue. And my interpretation here is that these are all technical detail discussions that sort of best dealt with on the mailing list eventually, and we still sort of faced with the problem of sort of what's our starting point. Unless somebody else sort of steps up here and sort of presents an alternative approach, I think what we're left here is basically a choice between option A and option B, right? We're either starting with like some version of XAuth or some version of XYZ. unless the authors or actually want to step up and propose some sort of merging process. But we haven't actually seen any evidence of that yet on this meeting or on the mailing list. So what's your sense, Yaron and Roman? My sense right now is that we should be thinking about HUM here on sort of what the stuff that we have on the table, which is either of these options as a starting point.
I'm not. So I think it's not the right time for HUM for two reasons. One is technical. I think our HUM process, our technical HUM process on Meet Echo is still not very good. And second, basically Kathleen threw out a provocation, and I would like people to stand up and say, hey, yes, XYZ is definitely the way to go. We're convinced by everything that Kathleen analyzed. Oh no, this doesn't work for us, and XAuth is definitely the right starting point for NAP. I'm not hearing either of these so far.
So I'm leaning closer to Yaron. I mean, so what Kathleen has done for us, which was very fabulous, was comparing the A to B, but really what she ended with is proposing we can do one of three things, right? We can say we're going to choose A and take the components we want from B and put them into A. We can start with B, take components of A and put them in B, or we can say we learned a lot of great things from A and B, and well, in that case, we need to really figure out what we want to put in the shell of how to make C. All of those matter in the details, and that's what the working group would need to decide. I think what Kathleen ended up with is saying we're going to choose one particular option, and let's just call that A, and what we're going to take from B and put that in A and call that the starting point. I haven't heard kind of a lot of pushback from that, but I think there's a lot of technical meat to how we would be doing that coalescing. And I think we should give the working group a little time to perhaps kind of think through what is the implication of that. But what I find very interesting is that I haven't heard a lot of folks kind of run up and say, wow, that's the wrong composition of things at this very gross level.
XYZ draft is a better starting point, if that wasn't clear. Right, and some of the pieces structure-wise should be pulled in, but I wouldn't want to see things like the simplification of the relationships changed, right? And the way the flows are defined in XYZ, I do think is better. So there's some pieces, but it's not, I'm not proposing as big a lift, I think, is what you may have heard.
All right, Mike, go ahead.
Mike. So you need to start your audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, there's been a whole thread, actually a set of them on the XAuth mailing list about how to handle identity claims, which is, I think, one of the important architectural features of the new protocol work that we'll do. And I will stand up and say that I believe that XAuth did a much better and well thought out job of handling identity claims and reusing what's already been done than XYZ did. In particular, note that this charter said that we're not going to be doing new identity schemas. and Dick figured out how to use the schemas that we already have. If I were choosing on that basis, I would start with XAuth. If the working group decides to do something else, I would fall back to recommending that we take all the identity portions from XAuth and replace all the identity treatment in XYZ with that, and probably make Dick co-editor, at least for handling the initial identity work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ben.
Okay, so I guess, Mike, to respond to that, if you think that Dick has done a lot of good work with how XAuth is handling identity, I think a key question is how transferable that work is. Like, can we take that representation for existing identity mechanisms and slot that into some other protocol without great effort? Or is it deeply ingrained into XAuth?
No, I think it, in fact, XAuth started without any identity, then it was added in. And it's localized to just a few places in XYZ, that there's a request and a response, both of which are JSON. And Dick's are likewise using a request syntax and a response syntax, which are JSON. And it's probably, less than an hour's work for a good editor to graph Dick's identity treatment into Justin's draft.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Might be helpful to ask is, what does the working group think that they would need to help them decide? What would be the way ahead? I mean, what additional kind of analysis, what additional thinking? I mean, it could be as simple as, we may need more time to kind of review, but what helps the working group to get to the point of kind of figuring out what that consolidation, if anything, would look like? Because if no one has any questions about, frankly, kind of, they don't feel like they need that information, it seems like then we would be ready to ask kind of questions about how to proceed with a more consensus-oriented hump.
I mean, it could also be the case that the working group doesn't actually know what it doesn't know, right? Given the traffic on the mailing list, which is sort of primarily involves 2 or 3 people, 2 of which are the main authors here, it could very well be that not enough people are sort of feel that they are up to speed. This is one of the reasons why the chairs asked somebody who's sort of new to GNAP to come in and sort of do the side-by-side analysis, just to get somebody an outsider's perspective on this stuff. And I think it might not be possible to answer that question, but I'm very curious to see if somebody steps up and says, "Oh, this is exactly what I need in order to make a decision." Is to add sort of more fuel to the fire here. Another option I guess we could be talking about as a working group is to put together a small design team and task them to come back with a sort of a concrete proposal. Right? Grab maybe along the lines of grab these parts from this and join with that, and maybe add this. Maybe along the lines of sort of Kathleen's suggestions. and that design team could then sort of form a core set of editors for the. I'm sure, we're looking at more than one document here. I'm throwing that out there as another idea to consider. And Dick, go ahead.
Maybe we can get a volunteer or a couple other volunteers to maybe join Justin and I as the design team to go and sit, and that smaller group sit back and propose how to move forward. So I'm up for that idea. Justin, maybe you can say whether you are, and then maybe we can see if there's anybody else that wants to volunteer to work with Justin and I.
So let's have Justin go next.
Yeah, I'd be okay with that, and I think that the suggestions that Kathleen and Mike have made in terms of how things could move forward for that design team, basically, take the best parts of all of the input documents and pull them together, and create, GNAP version 0. Or at least a proposal for that. I'd be a little worried about that just turning into a case of, instead of comparing A and B, it's comparing A and B and C, and people wanting some other combination of that. But I also think it's important that we realize this is just the starting point. We should be picking the best structure to start with. So while I'd be okay with the design team, I think that's probably more than what we need right now in order to get started on what GNAP is.
Can I suggest that we use the next week to come up with a 4 or 5 person team, and then the next month to come up with a concrete proposal?
But before we go there, Yaron, let's sort of let the at least empty the queue. And how much time do we have? Anyway, while we think about that, Michael, you're up.
So I was basically, yes, I suggested the design team, and I was sort of like, well, what else are you going to do, right? As if there was another option. So I was assuming that, yeah, you would ask Dick and you would ask Julian and maybe 1 or 2 other people to help lifting. I think the hardest problem the design team is going to have, and this may be worth actually the week time that you have, is deciding how to structure the content, because as I understand, Julian split documents up a little bit, and all the documents are quite large. And so I think that the question is, what part can you build a minimum viable product in less words, and then proceed forward? That's what I would say you need to do.
You mean Justin, right? When you say Julian.
Keep writing J, and that's the one that popped in my head. Sorry.
Very good, because there is a Julian anyway, or several. Bob, you're up.
I'm kind of lurking here. I'm interested in this in terms of future work with unmanned aircraft, in terms of safety officers that already have their own identity system, their own federated PKI, being able to, on an extremely short time frame, being able to authenticate and get information. Now, how that's going to be built in the coming year is really questionable, but timing is going to be important to me. How fast things can be done is going to be really important when you have 7 seconds between the time you see that drone to the fact it could hit you. So every millisecond in the process, matters. So that's where I'm going to be looking at this in terms of and timing optimizations for a very highly time-dependent authorization use case.
Given the fact that we're actually out of time, technically, I think what we're going to do is, Yaron, I think your suggestion, that somebody else Michael already pointed out, your suggestion is sort of essentially what we can do at this point, right? I'm inclined not to let Mike speak because we are actually out of time. And Yaron, do you have any? Would you like to sort of just repeat what you said before about our progress before MeetEcho kills our session?
Yes. So again, Leif and I will come back to the list with a proposed process, and I believe we will move forward with the idea of a small design team with a very limited timeline to come up with a high-level proposal on how to combine the existing proposals and to move forward.
All right. Given that we're out of time, Mike, if you want to say something real quick, and then I think we're.
So yeah, I would say that's a reasonable plan forward. I think the next thing we also need to do is pin an interim meeting as soon as we can on the calendar to do follow up here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All I was going to say was that if there's a design team, I would be willing to participate.
Thank you, Mike.
And if anybody else want to volunteer, please send us private email separately, and we'll take all of that under consideration when we form the team. And with that, I think we're going to thank everybody for turning up at this ungodly hour for some of you.
Thank you.
We will see you all soon at an interim meeting where we will make more progress. Thank you very much.